Okay, by my clock, it's 1 after, so let's go ahead and get started. Remind everyone that this session is not part of the IETF, but rather a broader community, but we want to follow the note well. We agreed to do that for this group. So please recognize your rights, privileges, and responsibilities under the note well. And second is that please, we're going to treat everyone with respect. Feel free to attack ideas, but don't attack people. In other words, be kind and respectful. As I sent in email only maybe a half hour ago, the focus of today is going to be whether it's okay to make changes to the XML as we update the tooling. And we need to tease apart whatever issues are intertwined in that statement, and hopefully then get the documents updated in time for us to reach some kind of consensus coming out of the face-to-face meeting. Paul, go ahead.
Sorry to jump in so quickly, but when you say update the tooling, do you just mean the tools, or do you also mean the 3.1, the actual format that we are doing the XML?
So I do mean the schema and the tooling. So
okay, thank you.
Changes to the tooling that are necessary to implement an update to the schema or to fix bugs.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so so that is the topic of discussion. One agenda item that I expect will have many issues that we end up teasing apart. Pete, anything to add before we dive in?
Nope, I will be taking notes in the little hedge doc if anyone cares to join me and help me with that. But other than that, I'll let you, Russ, lead the little parade here today.
Lead the parade. Okay, so who wants to begin by raising issues? We know we have a couple documents that suggest it's okay to make these changes, and we'd like to hear support or concerns. Elliot, go ahead.
Well, again, a very good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, chairs, for setting this up. As I said in email, I want to extend a special thank you to Paul and Martin for taking darts on a really tough set of issues. I think I want to just start by asking that the list that I mentioned in email just being incorporated by reference, if you will. So we can go through them one by one if you want, but maybe we can issue track them through to make sure that they get addressed. I want to stress that I view the document relatively positively. I don't know if we'll quite finish by Prague, but
I said stretch goal. Let's.
but I don't think it's an unworthy goal. I don't think it's I think it's a stretch, but not a ridiculous one. So
Right.
let me stop there for the moment and let others talk.
Okay, Jay, you're next.
Thanks, Russ. So I want to just open this up with a little thought experiment, just briefly, okay? Imagine that we took the existing RFC XML documents, and to each one of them, we added a section at the top that was Dublin Core metadata compliant, metadata about that document. If we did something like that, where we're simply adding something to the RFC, we're not changing anything there, do we have to think in terms of that then replacing the previous one? This is the question for me. Is it possible for us to start thinking about multiple XML documents that do different things or in different ways? The example I gave in my email just now was, what if we had one in Spanish, for example? I think part of the problem we've got here is this view that we're always replacing something else and having to get rid of something else, and that's driving some of our thoughts around this. Whereas we can possibly consider a broader approach than that, and that perhaps might make our life easier.
Anyone want to react to Jay's comment?
Could I butt in?
Okay.
Yeah, actually, Dublin Core is kind of not a great example because those actually would go in the rendered HTML version. But I take his point. But my impression is there is some significant disagreement on like what is the point of having XML and what is the point of rendering stuff. And I talk to a lot of people where I sort of get the impression that they think the idea is like we go to all this effort to create the XML, and then we come up with the rendered versions, and then we're done, and the rendered versions are all that matter, which I think is profoundly misguided. Because the point, I believe the reason we switched to XML in the first place is both so we can put in more semantic stuff than you can get in just with nroff, but equally so that we're not stuck with the rendered versions we have now. And the obvious example is EPUB. It's like I read a lot of stuff on an e-reader, and having an EPUB version of RFCs would be nice. And if we have a consistent, if all of our RFCs are in a consistent version of XML, which implicitly means like if we change the XML, we're gonna do it infrequently enough that we can retroactively update the old XML so it's all in the same grammar. But assuming we do that, then okay, fine. If somebody writes an EPUB renderer, and we render them into EPUB, and now we have a new format. Or 10 years from now, people are using, I don't know, brain implant glasses or something, and there's a brain implant glasses format. We want to be able to render into that. So that, I guess what I'm saying is, while I think we need to make some changes, because partly because there's some of the changes, some of the details of the current versions of this current XML are just weird, like the fact that you got the name of the document in multiple places, But I also think that it shouldn't be that hard to figure out what's worth changing, and change it in a way that we can keep all of the XML consistent, and which probably means limiting the changes to ones that can be updated automatically.
I'd like to hear more about what you mean by limiting changes to ones that can be updated automatically. By that, I mean limiting changes to the XML or limiting changes to publication formats. Which did you mean?
Oh, to the XML. I mean, the whole point of the publication formats not being canonical is like, you want a new publication format, fine, if we took the earliest XML RFCs and ran them through the current version of XML to RFC and looked at the PDFs, they would be quite different. Okay.
Yes.
Which I think is fine, because the PDF is everything that's in the PDF is supposed to be derived from the XML. So what I particularly had in mind here was like, my favorite bit of brokenness, which is the postal addresses. I mean, I believe we can write a script that will mechanically take the postal addresses in the format they are now and turn them into a more stable one where it's just lines of text, and I don't think we can do that for any possible XML document that anyone might ever write, but I'm quite confident we can do it for the ones we've already published, and similarly, it's like up at the top, there is a field which currently has the name of the draft that it was, the name of the draft appears in two places. The first place, it really should be the name of the RFC. Again, that's something that we can do mechanically. So it's that kind of stuff. And then beyond that, we might add new stuff. Carson wants all sorts of things to be able to do, more flexible embedding of different kinds of elements, which if they just add new options, then there's nothing to change. But I'm kind of rambling. Did I answer your question?
You did. Thank you. Okay, Robert.
So implicit in what John was saying and what I had originally thought was going to be a clarifying question is now a point. I believe John is saying that we have to tightly couple defining the grammar we want with whatever we want to do with republishing all of our RFCs, because all of our XML RFCs need to be in the exact same grammar from the beginning to the end of time. And anytime we were going to change the grammar, we would uplift all of the RFCs that are in RFC XML to be in that grammar. I'm not sure I agree with that view. I would like to see a world where we can have incremental improvement instead of huge waterfall change every time we identify a thing that we want to change. John used the word it should be relatively easy to several times, and I point to the large number of months that have gone by since we have had known brokenness that we could relatively easy fix in the code, but we can't go change the code because we haven't built an agreement. So this, stop.
Russ, Russ, you're on mute, but I'm assuming you said that I could speak next.
Sorry, yes, I called you.
So I am, having talked to lots of consumers of RFCs, I am of the feeling that it doesn't matter if the XML, the XML document changes over time. That is, there are essentially no people who will care about that. And for the small number of people who, I shouldn't say essentially no, there's an extreme, and I apologize for that because there are some people who do care. For the very small number of people who care about that, if they know that there's a chance that the XML that they're holding right now, that they are using for some development or something like that might change, if they have an easy way of getting the new one, seeing the diffs and such like that, that would suffice for them. Which means that for everybody else, since they're not looking in the XML, they're looking in the derived formats. It's fine to do this as long as there is archiving. If there's archiving and some way of finding out and such like that, this is good enough for the vast majority of the users of the RFC series. It's not going to work for everybody, and that's okay.
Russ,
Awesome.
once again, you didn't unmute.
It's early. So I think that one of my disagreements with Paul in the last couple of days on this topic didn't really talk about this idea of can we retroactively change or not, but was more about the way in which we bind future cells to do a particular thing. I think there's any number of things we can decide to do in this space. We can decide to change the format for only future RFCs. And Julian points out we could decide to make extensions. And the example of that is the discussion that's going on about having some sort of way to put mathematical symbols or equations in documents. And so we could decide to do that for future documents only, or we could decide to backport it to some of the existing RFCs that have mathematical formula. That would potentially be a manual process, unfortunately. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily wise. So we could simply decide to draw a line in the sand and say, all future RFCs get this feature and the previous ones don't. That's an extension. The sorts of things that John was talking about with address tags and whatnot are fixes that I think would be reasonably applied retroactively, which would get us closer to the goal of having every single RFC XML being the same and being able to be processed with the same tools. which I think is a fine goal to have, but not necessarily a constraint that we need to apply to ourselves in the future. So I'm sort of wondering why we have to talk about this in the abstract when there are specific examples that we can use and different decisions we could make in the future.
Jay.
Thanks. This binding ourselves to the future bit is the really key bit to me. If we imagine that we're 10 years down the track, we have another 3,000 RFC XML RFCs published. Do we really want to, if we at that point, if we decide to make a change to the XML, have to go back and edit 3,500 or more, 4,000 RFCs in order to implement that change? And if people say, yeah, 4,000 is fine, at what point does that become ridiculous? Is it 5,000, 10,000 or something? To me, it's unsustainable. At some point, we have to just accept that there will be two versions of RFC XML that are the definitive versions. And at some point in the future, there might be three, and at some point later, there might be four. So that then leads to the second question, which is, are we then going to maintain tools forever? In 10 years' time, 20 years' time, are we going to say we're going to have a tool that can still reproduce the version, the publication formats that were used 10 years ago from the 10-year-old version of RFC XML? And my answer is no, of course we're not going to do that. So I think that this is actually quite important. We're sometimes thinking about RFCs as if this is some kind of software process, as if we need to be able to demonstrate that the code still runs almost, that publication format. I don't think it is. I think this is an informational format. We're getting something out, and once it's done, it's done. We don't need to go back and change it. So which is why I'm equally of the view that if we change the RFC XML to fix the address problem that John wants changed, and which I do as well, we don't need to regenerate the output formats as a result of it, because we don't have to prove that we can. So those are, to me, some logical conclusions that we come to if we start thinking, how's it going to be like in 10 or 20 years' time?
Okay, Elliot.
Yeah, great conversation. Everybody's making good points. One of the things that occurred to me is that it may be, if we're going to make changes to, to the document, suppose we have to change the output format, or we find a bug, or if there's an improvement that seems universally good. I think I mentioned this on the previous call. I just want to restate it because it may be something we could find value in, which is to borrow from the publication industry and use the print. There's a printing number that's on every book. Now, it's not very common that you would see this on a web page, right? Per se, because web pages are generally considered to be quite dynamic in nature. But for our purposes, what we need in the brand is stability. But a reprinting is not something that people would view as an unstable thing. So we have some tools in the toolbox. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I thought that, and I said this in the email, but I'll bring it up again here. I thought that Paul's initial take, at least on section 4.1 in adding constraints to change, I thought was a pretty good take. And I think it needs a little bit of more specificity, as I said, but I think it's well on the way in the direction that I would go to. So we have some tools, and we have some reasonably good text. And to Jay's point, I just want to say that I generally agree with what he's saying. It could be that we want to change certain adornments in certain publication formats over time. Do we have to change those backward compatibly? It may make sense to do so. If you think about having a heavily linked system in which you're bouncing between RFCs and you want to keep, say, the sides, if you will, or the frames coordinated, you might have to make certain changes there. I might be even okay with that. We just have to be, I think, somewhat careful as how at how we do this, and that we walk, crawl, walk, run on this. And the last point I'll make is that we get to do this again. That is to say, whatever decisions we make, and let's make some, we can update those based on operational experience. We don't have to have perfect be the enemy of good. We can decide what we agree on, at least, move forward on that, and continue to discuss things that we couldn't yet come to agreement. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Go ahead, Paul.
This is actually a question for Jay. I didn't understand the last bit of what you said. If there's an agreement, and I think that there is, that we don't have to change all of some existing set of RFCs if there are changes to the vocabulary, or if there are changes, as Elliot just brought up, to the desired the way the desired output looks. And we've seen that already, just as a side note, when we went from plain text in the plain text format now, it's not paginated. We didn't go and unpaginate the 8,000 RFCs that are already published. So we do have history of doing it. But Jay, I didn't understand if at the end when you said, well, we might change the XML in a way that would not necessarily appear in any of the output formats, and therefore we don't need to regenerate the output formats. Is that what you said?
Sort of. So what I said was that if we make a change to the RFC XML, that we expect or intend not to have an effect on the content of the output format, then we don't need to regenerate. It's actually, to me,
we don't need to regenerate which? We don't need to regenerate the XML, or we don't need to regenerate
They don't need to regenerate the output format. So specifically, the example I was giving was the address change. Okay, we are not going to change the data of the addresses. We're going to change the way that they're held in the XML with the same data, and we are not into, the way that is then output in terms of the ordering of those data objects for an address may change without us doing considerable effort to ensure it's exactly the same output. Okay. But ultimately, none of that matters to me. The fact that we have an RFC in XML with a set of data objects that are the ones that are in the output format is fine. The fact that we haven't generated that output format from that RFC XML doesn't bother me in the slightest. The output format is still correct. It's just got a slightly different ordering of the address objects, which is trivial as far as addresses go. So,
okay, so wait, stop. I hear what you're saying, but I want to point out something that I have said and other people have said on the mailing list, which is if we change the XML and we don't change the PDF, we've broken a promise that the PDF holds the XML. If we change the PDF, then we need to regenerate the HTML. So either we stop making the promise that the PDF holds the XML.
If you recall, I have a sneaky trick around that, which is we simply edit the PDF to take out.
And other people on the list pointed out that that's a horrible idea that is not necessarily going to work. Why do that instead of just regenerate it?
Because regeneration is ultimately a very risky thing to do, because we have no way of validating that the content has not changed. It's difficult. It's a hard problem for PDFs. We can potentially do it for text files, okay, but for PDFs, it's a hard problem.
Okay, so I disagree. We will have to have this one on the list. I fundamentally disagree with the idea that you edit a PDF, even if we believe it safely, to change the XML and not regenerate the PDF. To me, that sounds horribly risky given what I know of the PDFA format. But okay, thanks. That answers my question.
So
Okay, Pete?
I have a question, I think mostly as chair, to try and get my head around what's being said here. Because I haven't heard something that John Levine mentioned earlier discussed. If we want to publish a new rendering format, EPUB, an audio book that is automatically generated, not read from the text, et cetera, et cetera. If we decide that we need a new output format, what does that mean for the XML? Do we go back and are we going to have to recreate tools for old XML or in order to generate the new publication format for the old RFCs? Do we not generate new publication format for the old RFCs, or do we adjust the XML so we only have to build one XML tool? I'd like to know what the thoughts are on that. But
Okay.
Julian can
John,
go and make his comment.
Okay.
I see others coming.
So, starting with your question, when you say audiobook, maybe you have some hints in the XML in mind that would affect the rendering of the audiobook, like something affecting the voice. I mean, we should be able to produce audiobooks without these hints, but adding those hints probably, the idea probably would be to make the quality better. So that would be just an extension of the RFC, of the XML format, right? And not necessarily be needed in old XML, in old source code. Anyway, what I wanted to say is, going back to Jay, I think the idea of trying not to regenerate publication formats because we think we don't need it is horrible. I currently spend like 80% of my time working on technical debt, where people thought it would be a good idea not to update dependencies in a large project because the old ones did work. And then suddenly we find out, oh, we need to update. And then we find out, oh, since we updated last, there were 100 changes that we didn't like. And what do we do now? Do we fork the project? Do we build different libraries with different versions of the dependency and so on? This is where madness starts. So if we think that we have a change that will affect the renderings, we absolutely should generate everything and try to write tooling that verifies the output. But assuming that if we generate the PDF with version n and then skip versions n+1 to n+9 and then find out that we want to regenerate it with version n+10, but we've note that we have tons of changes that broke it in between, but didn't notice, then we have a hell of an update problem. So break things early so that they get detected when we can undo things. Just saying we are probably not going to re-render this one, and then 5 years later we find out we need to re-render it, but all the changes we made in the tools have undesired effects for that specific RFC, then we have a forking problem. And I absolutely don't want that. And keep in mind, I'm talking here from the perspective of one of the authors of the grammar, one of the maintainers of a renderer, and as an author of multiple not that unimportant RFCs. So I see it from all potential perspectives, I think. So you really don't want to skip pre-rendering if you don't have to. For what it's worth, we recently had an XML to RFC update that undid a change that broke output. And I actually catch that because I'm re-rendering all the XML source files that I have with that tool. I only catch it too late. But if we would do that in our production of RFC XML, re-render everything and check for diffs, that change wouldn't have gone unnoticed. That was a completely avoidable breakage. So sorry for the long rant.
Point of clarification.
Okay,
from
John.
Julie.
I think I'm going to kind of thread the needle and agree both with Julian and with Jay. I think in the short term, there's some changes we would make, like to fix the mistakes, and there also there's a certain amount of, for historical crufty reasons, there are elements that it can appear in one place but not in another place that you would think would be the same. So I think that we could do, using what we have learned from V3 over the past year, I think we could do one change that would clean up, the mistakes in the grammar, and and come up with something clean and extensible. And to the extent that change stuff, then we would mechanically fix the XML. So going forward, call that 3.1. So now everything is in 3.1, and we continue to publish in 3.1. And if people want to add new stuff like the improved math stuff in ways that's backwards compatible, we can just go ahead and do that and update the tools, and we don't have to change anything because the old 3.1 continues to be valid. And this is what we've been doing all along. I mean, if you look at the earliest XML RFCs, there's all sorts of features that's there. There's all sorts of backwards compatible additions to the grammar that aren't used in the early RFCs, but it doesn't matter because they still render. At some point, I imagine we'll get to the point where, like, wow, we've learned so much that we're going to change stuff completely. And then we have a V4, and at that point, I think then we need to decide, okay, is it practical to mechanically turn V3.1 plus into V4, or it's just going to be like V2 to V3 and simply say, okay, we're going to start over with a new version of the tools. But I think that's not going to happen for a very long time. So I think in the short term, sort of fix the mistakes, mechanically fix the XML so that everything's now in a format we like. And now also we have and now we can establish a process where we can make backwards compatible additions, which is what most people are asking for, in ways that don't break the old XML, don't require re-rendering, and the tools continue to work on all the stuff that's published.
So, John, I think I hear you saying we don't have to deal with the bigger issue now. Let's deal with a pragmatic, make things more consistent. And then once we've lived with that for a while, we can consider whether we want to open the bigger can of worms.
Yeah, I mean, the one place that might not work is with diagrams, because the current diagram grammar attempted to specify exactly what elements can be used in one combination, which turns out not to work. What it should have done is simply specify sort of the out. For example, I mean, what we want is the diagrams have to be black and white. And so it's specified you can only use like a 1-bit palette. And in fact, the tools all use bigger palettes, but they only have 2 colors in them. So we need to go back there and say, well, what you can do is, basically specify in terms of results rather than inputs. And we can probably do that in a way that's backwards compatible, but I simply don't understand XML graphics well enough to know whether that works. So with that caveat, I'm basically saying yes to your question.
Okay. Jay.
And before Jay goes, just a quick reminder to people, John, if you plan to speak repeatedly, go ahead and just use the local mute button in the lower right instead of turning on and off your mic, because you get clipped at the beginning sometimes.
Thanks, Vic. So just to reply to Julian, I'm not saying this just because we don't need to re-render the PDFs and re-render any of the extra formats. because the risk of doing it is so high, because the formal verification that nothing else has changed except what we expect to have changed is such a problem. Now, in the particular case, if Martin's correct and there should be, for the address change, and there should be no change to the ordering, what we're doing then is we are re-rendering something to prove that absolutely nothing changes. And I don't think we need to republish, 1,000 whatever RFCs with nothing changed to prove that nothing changes, to be honest. So that's the big bit. It's the risk. And if somebody comes up with a nice way of saying, yes, we can be certain that we can take the scale of a large set of PDFs and verify those against another set of PDFs and say that the only thing that has changed is the thing that we think should have changed, then I'll change my mind on that. But I'm a long way from hearing that that's possible. The second thing is, we're going to get to this point eventually. We're not able to continually always update the RFC XML of old RFCs for every change that comes along. At some point, we're just going to have to stop, and say, right, and effectively at that point, we do fork it and we have two sets of things. So my point of view basically is that we should accept that that's going to happen and plan for when we want that to happen. And that is, I fully agree with John. It's a pragmatic choice. We don't have to do it now. We could do this, the effectively the backporting for version 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and maybe do it for a version 4 or something like that. But at some point we need to expect that and then incorporate that into our plans.
Elliot.
All right. So what I would just add, in listening to Julian, right, he spotted problems during doing his own re-rendering, which I think is great, Julian. What I wanted to know was whether you felt republication was necessary in those cases, even in addition to re-rendering, because I think everybody agrees it's fine. Well, I don't know about everybody, but certainly I agree that it's fine to re-render everything when you make a change, but whether you republish that re-rendering, I think is a separate decision. Jay's point, I think, is that there's great risk in that sort of mass republication. And to me, I see that risk as well. I think it is an issue, at least initially. And I think I want to avoid mass republication immediately. But I would like to see, for instance, a distinction made between essentially doing CI/CD on the re-rendering, which I think is a reasonable thing to do, and the republication. And with that, if it's okay for Julian to sort of jump the queue, I'd like to hear from him personally.
So yeah, you're right that re-rendering and republication are not the same thing. But I mean, the interesting thing here is there are people who say that there's a risk that if we re-render things, we will not catch subtle bugs. But then they will go unnoticed if we don't republish. So that goes back to what I said earlier. If something is broken, we better find out as quickly as possible instead of years later when it's very hard to fix. So that's why I absolutely think that republishing everything is actually the best thing, because if we break something, the probability that somebody will notice that and that we can fix that early is much bigger than if we do not republish. The thing that I wanted to say when I jumped on the queue regarding non-compatible changes that we might do in the future, maybe it's makes sense to look at what non-compatible changes we actually made in the past between V2 and V3. And the biggest ones were actually the grammar for lists. That was very different from HTML, and we just adopted essentially what HTML has. And tables where essentially the same happened. So these were areas where the special way of XML of the RFC XML grammar was needlessly different from HTML. And that's why we changed that. And we, back then, as the old format was only a tool and not an official IETF format, we said it's okay to make an incompatible change if we have a conversion tool. So these, as far as I can tell, these are the two big changes we made from V2 to V3 that actually required a conversion step, nothing else.
Okay, John?
Sorry, that's an old hand.
Paul?
So two things, and I recognize we're getting close to the top of the hour. The first one is I disagree that that there's going to be a great risk if we mess up the PDF format. The number of people who rely on the PDF format, not the others, at least from anecdotal information, is extremely low. And we already know, looking through some of the PDFs right now that are being generated today, the way we render as PDF is highly non-optimal. If you look at page breaks, some of them are really terrible. And yet we don't hear complaints about it. So I am way less concerned about re-rendering PDFs and the risk of them. I consider PDF to be the minor format among those formats. Again, with respect to the people who we care most about, who are using the RFC series. I just don't see developers going, oh, I don't care if there's an HTML version of this RFC. I'm going to read the PDF instead. That just seems super unlikely. I agree that there is definitely a risk that we'll screw things up. I don't agree that the effect of that risk is very high at all. So I would like us to worry less about it. I really would. And we know that there are tools that we can do, CI/CD type checking for the text and for the HTML. We can visually re-render HTML and do comparisons very easily. That's a very well-known system already. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up, and there's way too few people on the call for this, so I would like it high on the agenda in Prague, is do we want the 7990 update document to actually be an update or an obsolete? Meaning right now, and Martin brought this up when when he and I were working on the current draft of the patches that I have are incomplete and they don't really go into enough effect. They're good enough for understanding, but not really, the whole thing. But if we want to do a whole one, no, I'm not going to be able to even get a new version out before the draft cutoff on Monday. So I think that's a reasonable thing to ask in Prague. And if we do want to do a full update, we need to ask Heather, how she wants to deal with authorship on it.
Okay, go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, so I agree with Paul about the PDF. I think Jay's zero tolerance to any sort of risk of change on these things is, to my mind, unreasonable. I think that we have tools for managing that risk, and we should employ those tools. But the way that I framed it in my draft is that this group is responsible for understanding the scope of the risk and making a decision based on that understanding. That's it. That's the extent of our responsibility. And it might be that, Jay will argue that changing the PDF in this case is too risky. I don't agree. I think there's a number of ways in which we can manage that risk to reduce the problem. I actually think that the idea that we have professionals reviewing PDFs in great detail is probably an expense we can skip, but that's a separate thing. I wanted to follow up on Paul's question about documents. So I think there's three ways we can update documents, and I don't much care, but I do have some opinions. One is we could produce a replacement for RFC 7990 and attempt to rewrite it. I think that would be a lot of work. In having looked at it in past times with respect to Heather and the people that put a lot of work in on that document, I think it's poorly written. I don't think it suits our needs right now. The second way is the way that Paul has attempted to approach the updates, which is to look at the specific pieces of text and replace those specific chunks of text. Again, I think that carries a risk that you make what is in effect a patch to the original document that can be inconsistent, and that carries risks as well. I prefer the third approach, which is to say we are changing 7990 and we are making the following specific change, and describe the change, but don't talk about specific changes to text, and say where this new document says things, those are authoritative if it disagrees with the original, and don't worry about that. And that's essentially the approach that I took with my draft. And this is, I think, part of the substance of the disagreement between Paul and I, although I think we were having a number of different discussions about the nature of how we make those changes as well. So it'd be really good if we can get a list of those issues out, and I can probably volunteer to write a list of those, because I already have that. Sorry, that was too much at once.
Okay, Paul, I think you want to respond.
I do. And first to say, no, that wasn't too much. I think we need to do that. You know, we need to have that discussion. I agree with Martin that those are the three options. I actually think the entire rewrite of 7990 is a worthwhile exercise now, even though it is biting off more work, because someone who's looking either at, as Martin calls it, and I think legitimately, my patch file, or his issues list, where we say, just in general, this is definitive, they won't be able to lay them down on 7990 that well. Even now in this working group, we are seeing confusion and disagreements between what our beliefs on RFC 9280 says and means. I think the RPAT is even having some of those internally. Therefore, the effort of writing it down, getting consensus, and nailing it down is, in fact, the correct thing to do, even though I'm volunteering for more work. Even though I'm volunteering for more work, in saying that, I'm volunteering a lot of other people to do more work. Martin is also correct that a lot of the wording in 7990 seemed good at the time, but did not age at all well as we started actually implementing the new model. And therefore, a document that says this is the way, you know, with our current understanding of the new model, to me seems a better way to go, given that Jay is absolutely right. This will come up at least a few times over the next decade, either with additions or changes to the vocabulary, or additions of new formats that the IETF does or does not want to support, or quite frankly, that one stream does or does not want to support. I think having a solid document, you know, that says this is the way it is in 2023, or more likely 24, is the best way to go.
Not that I think it's worth it today, unless we think it's going to be pretty quick, but there is a discussion going on about abandonment of the PDFs, which needs to be surfaced at some point in Prague, if not before.
Okay, so that links, by the way, Pete, to the issue that I mentioned about the archival of text currently not being clear. But I wanted to just highlight something you said, Paul, because I thought it really showed the possibilities of this effort and the strength of the way that we've done things in the organization in the past, which is, we wrote 791 based on the previous operational experience. Now we have new operational experience, and we're just applying that. So running code, if you will, is what's driving us. I thought that was something worth noting. So whether as you saw, my preference is to just do an obsoletes, but that's always my preference. And I'll remind Russ that the moment he became IETF chair, I said, go try to read all the process RFCs. And somehow or another he did. But I think it's easier if we try to not spread things out across documents when we don't have to. I know it's a bit more work for this group, and I wouldn't insist on it. I'm not insisting, but I think it's a nice preference. And if it's something that we can do, would be great. Thank you.
Okay, observing that we have less than 10 minutes. Pete, you've been taking notes. Do you see any form of consensus or just disagreement?
We seem to be moving back and forth, but I guess, I mean, I wouldn't mind doing a small nose count on people who lean toward Jay's view and people who lean toward, I don't want to call it, well, let's just call it Martin and Julian's view for some people.
So
but
do
I
hum,
don't
kind of
we have that tool, but I'm not sure. Well,
right. But the question is, how do you word it? Do you agree with Martin or Jay? There's not a yes no question.
What does the tool currently look like? We can make
it works best if you ask a yes no question.
Yeah.
Do you agree with Martin? Maybe would be a way to put it.
Well, look. How about just click on raise hand if you are leaning Martin, and click on do not raise hand if you are leaning Jay, just to pick random. Does that work?
Okay.
Please specify about.
Yeah, I'm writing now. Raise hand.
A lot of things to it.
If lean. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Do you lean towards Martin? Yes or no?
There you go. And there's only 10 of us here. We could probably have done it by voice. Interesting.
Wow. 2/3, 1/3.
Yeah. Not a screaming obvious consensus. But actually the numbers are not entirely what I expected, so that's at least some piece of useful data. Paul?
Yeah, but I would not call that consensus.
No, by no means.
No, and this is totally the wrong forum to do that in. You've got a bunch of active participants in the working group who are not on this call.
No, we're just trying to get a feel for the room.
Yeah.
This wasn't the consensus call.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, that was just, I was not getting a feel from the notes where things were swinging. And the answer is there is no way that things are clearly swinging. So, yeah, interesting.
Go ahead, Paul.
This is a question for the chairs. Is it your intention to try to get this discussion active on the mailing list pre-prog, or to wait for prog?
I would, certainly when I post the notes, I think it's going to be reasonable to say, here's the open question, and see if anybody comes out of the woodwork. I don't see any harm in doing that pre-prog.
I would prefer if you did it as two things. Here are the notes, and here is a question. because the notes, what we've done in the last hour covers a zillion things. And I think you have a specific question.
Yep,
So
that's
starting it with that, I think would be better. And that way we'll have a stronger feeling going into Prague.
Jay?
Thanks. So I've put a slightly different text in into the question into the chat, which Martin has just slightly disagreed with. But I was given some specific examples of where we don't have to re-render, and so I was trying to get to that principle there. Do people believe that there is a principle that we always have to re-render all the publication formats when the underlying XML changes? Because if we, to my view, it appears if we have some people who think that's a principle and others who think it isn't a principle but have differing views about when that might, it isn't a principle. And so we could perhaps test that. That was just a suggestion, that's all.
Yeah, my inclination is to, for Russ and I to knock heads together a bit ourselves, and I'm having trouble formulating what the issue is across people, right? That I think you're right. Some of it may be this issue of, do we always re-render? Is that a principle? But I think there's other stuff going on underneath, for some folks at least, and it may end up being multiple questions we're asking.
Can I just come back, Pete?
Yeah, of course.
I think you might find that actually that you'll get a better set of figures around where the consensus is about that requires or not, because it is, as far as I can tell, not many of us believe in that principle. We just disagree on the circumstances and the rules and policy about when we can do that, and so that's why I'm turning it around rather than that.
No, I get that. Here's my issue, and it comes down to Elliot's comment earlier, right? If there's an always re-render but don't republish principle, you may get a different kind of answer. And we want to be clear about what always re-render actually means to people.
Yeah, sorry, mine was always re-render and publish.
And republish it. Okay.
Right. Yes, and republish. That's what that's the principle I think needs testing.
Interesting. Okay. No, taken under advisement. Anything else in the 36 seconds remaining?
Left. So raise your hand if you think we should always re-render and publish. It's the same split. So I'm not sure, Jay. Okay.
In the other direction. That's lovely.
Yes, very interesting.
Thanks, Jay. No, I'm teasing.
All right, with that, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Need to ponder what all this means, but we will start a discussion on the mail list ahead of Prague in the hopes that will make Prague more productive. Thank you all.
Thanks.